200 feet beneath the surface of a Texas hillside. In the late winter of 1972, a man named Michel Cipher was losing his grip on time while his body continued to keep a rhythm of its own. He had descended alone into a cave called Midnight Cave, taking with him a tent, a supply of food, recording equipment, and electrodes glued to his scalp and chest that fed his vital signs to a team of researchers on the surface. There were no clocks. There was no daylight, no dawn, no dusk. Nothing to mark the passage of hours, except the single bare bulb he switched on when he judged himself awake, and off when he judged himself ready to sleep. His instructions were simple. He was to live by feel, eating when hungry and sleeping when tired, and to telephone the surface each time he woke, ate, and slept, so the team could compare what his mind believed about time against what his body was actually doing. Within weeks, his sense of the calendar had drifted badly. He would later guess the date to be more than a month earlier than it was. And yet the instruments told a different story. His sleeping and waking, his temperature, the rhythm of his physiology, continued to cycle with a regularity he could neither feel nor fully control, a steady internal beat that kept time in the absence of any sky. That experiment, and the long series of cave and bunker studies that surrounded it, settled a question that had lingered for centuries. For a long time, it was reasonable to assume that the daily rhythm of the human body was simply a response to the world outside it, that we slept because it grew dark and woke because it grew light, the body a passive instrument played by the sun. The men and women who spent weeks underground demonstrated something stranger and more important. Stripped of every external cue, the body did not fall into chaos. It kept running on a cycle close to a day, though not perfectly matched to 24 hours, generated from within, a clock that did not need the sun to tick, though it needed the sun to stay precisely set. The rhythm was not borrowed from the environment. It was built into the organism, and the environment merely tuned it, the way a radio signal corrects a watch that would otherwise keep reasonable but slightly imperfect time on its own. The discovery of where that clock lives and how it works unfolded across the second half of the 20th century and earned its central figures the Nobel Prize in 2017. Working first in fruit flies, researchers traced the rhythm down to the level of individual genes, and what they found has the quality of something almost too elegant to be accidental. Inside the cell, a small set of genes produces proteins that accumulate slowly through the hours. As those proteins build up, they drift into the cell's nucleus and switch off the very genes that made them, so that production halts. Then, over further hours, the proteins are gradually broken down. The brake is released, and the genes switch back on to begin the cycle again. One full turn of this loop, the building and the silencing and the clearing away, takes close to a day. This is the molecular pendulum, a feedback circuit of protein rising and falling, that runs in the dark, in the cold, in isolation. A chemical oscillation that constitutes, at the smallest scale, what it means for a living thing to tell time. In a human being, this molecular clock is not confined to one organ. The version most people have heard of sits deep in the brain, in a pair of tiny clusters of neurons, in the hypothalamus, called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, perhaps 20,000 cells in all, positioned just above the point where the optic nerves cross. This is the master clock, and it has a privileged connection to the eyes. A special set of cells in the retina, distinct from the ones we use to see images, contains a pigment that responds to light, and they report not shapes or detail, but simply the overall brightness of the world. They send that information directly to the master clock, which uses it to make small daily corrections, nudging the internal rhythm into alignment with the actual cycle of day and night. This is why light, and specifically the timing of light, is the most powerful signal the human clock receives. It is the mechanism by which the sun, without playing the rhythm, still sets it. But the part of this picture that the title gestures toward, the idea that the rhythm lives in the blood, turns out to be closer to the truth than a casual phrase has any right to be. The master clock in the brain is not the only timekeeper in the body. Nearly every tissue, nearly every individual cell, carries its own copy of the molecular clock, running the same feedback loop, and the master clock's job is less to generate the body's rhythm, single-handedly, than to keep this vast population of peripheral clocks synchronized, like a conductor holding an orchestra together. The heart keeps time, the cells of the immune system keep time, and the consequences of this circulate, quite literally, through the bloodstream. The hormone cortisol rises in the hours before waking and peaks early in the morning, preparing the body to meet the day, then falls away as evening approaches. Melatonin, its counterpart, stays low through daylight and climbs in the darkness, signaling to the body that night has come. Core body temperature swings across roughly a degree over the course of a day, reaching its lowest point in the small hours of the morning. Blood pressure dips at night and climbs toward morning. Even the composition of the blood itself shifts with the hour, the numbers and behavior of circulating immune cells changing between day and night, the tendency of the blood to clot, following its own daily curve. This is not metaphor or poetic license. Researchers have shown that a sample of blood contains, in the activity of its genes, enough information to estimate the internal time of the body it came from, sometimes within a few hours, and in some controlled settings, even more precisely because so many processes are stamped with the signature of the clock. The blood does, in a real and measurable sense, carry the time of day written into its chemistry. And the morning rise in cortisol and blood pressure, combined with the changing stickiness of the blood, helps explain one of the more sobering patterns in cardiology, the observation that heart attacks and strokes do not strike evenly around the clock, but cluster disproportionately in the hours after waking. The rhythm is not a gentle background hum. It can help tilt risk during the very hours when vulnerable people are already most exposed. What makes this rhythm feel less like a quirk of human physiology and more like an inheritance is how far back it runs. The daily clock is not a recent refinement of complex animals. It is found in plants, which open and close their leaves on schedule even in constant light. It is found in fungi. It is found, most tellingly, in cyanobacteria, the simple photosynthetic organisms that have existed for billions of years, and that helped fill the early atmosphere with oxygen. These single cells run a circadian clock, built on a different molecular foundation than ours, but performing the same essential task, anticipating the daily arrival of the sun. One influential hypothesis for why such an ancient clock arose at all is quietly menacing. Sunlight is not only a source of energy, it is also a source of damage. It's ultraviolet radiation capable of injuring the molecular machinery of the cell, and, in particular, the delicate process of copying DNA. A clock that could anticipate the day may have allowed early organisms to schedule their most vulnerable activities, including the replication of their genetic material, for the protection of darkness. The true origin is still debated, and several pressures likely mattered at once, from ultraviolet damage to the daily swings of metabolism, and the internal tides of oxidation that come with living in sunlight. But across these explanations, the theme is consistent. We did not invent this clock. We inherited it, refined and elaborated, from an unbroken lineage stretching back to organisms that timed their lives by a sun that was younger and fiercer than the one we know. It is here that the title's premise has to be examined rather than simply repeated, because the phrasing carries an implication worth resisting. To say that the blood remembers a rhythm the world forgot suggests that the body has lost something and must somehow recover it, and that the natural world around us has fallen silent. Neither is quite right. The body has not forgotten anything. The clock runs as faithfully now as it did in the cave and the bunker, in the bodies of people who have never given it a moment's thought. The molecular loop turns in your cells tonight, much as it turned in your ancestors. What has changed is not the clock, but the world it is trying to read, and the nature of that change is specific. For the entire history of life until very recently, the signal that set the clock was overwhelmingly clear. Days were bright, often far brighter than any indoor space, and nights were genuinely dark, lit only by the moon and stars and the dim flicker of fire. The contrast between day and night was enormous, and the clock had no difficulty distinguishing one from the other. Electric light collapsed that contrast, the lamp, and later the screen gave us bright light at any hour we chose, and it gave it to us often in the blue, rich part of the spectrum to which the clock-setting cells in the retina are especially sensitive. The result is not that the rhythm has been erased, but that it is being given confusing instructions. Light in the late evening, of the kind that pours from screens and ceiling fixtures, can push the clock later, telling the body that the day is not yet over, while the calendar insists it is. Morning that is spent indoors, under lighting far dimmer than the open sky, provides a weak correcting signal, so the clock drifts more freely than it should. The body, in effect, is being asked to keep accurate time in a world that has quietly muffled most of the cues it relies on, and then is asked to perform on a schedule set by work and society that pays the internal clock little attention at all. The mismatch between the time the body keeps and the time the world demands is the central disruption, and it has a name in the laboratory: circadian misalignment. The clearest demonstration of what this misalignment can do comes from the lives of people who work through the night. Shift workers, by occupational necessity, ask their bodies to be awake and active during the hours their clocks have prepared for rest, and to sleep during the hours their physiology is primed for wakefulness. The research on this population has accumulated into a consistent and concerning picture, linking long-term night shift work to elevated rates of metabolic disturbance, cardiovascular problems, and disruptions of mood and sleep. The association has been judged serious enough that an international cancer research body classified shift work involving circadian disruption as a probable carcinogen, a category that reflects strong but not conclusive evidence. It is important to be careful here because these are statistical associations across populations, rather than simple guarantees about any individual, and the underlying biology is tangled together with the practical hardships of night work, the poor sleep, the difficult meals, the social strain. But the weight of evidence points in a coherent direction. Living chronically out of step with one's internal clock appears to carry a real and measurable cost, distributed quietly across many systems of the body, rather than announcing itself in a single dramatic failure. And yet, the honest version of this story has to resist a romantic counter, myth as firmly as it resists the literal reading of the title, because it is tempting to imagine a lost golden age in which our ancestors lived in flawless harmony with the sun. And that picture does not survive scrutiny either. Pre-industrial life was not a model of serene circadian alignment. People rose before dawn and worked past dusk by firelight. Historical evidence suggests that in some societies, sleep itself was broken into two distinct stretches across the night, with a waking interval between them, a pattern quite unlike the single consolidated block we now treat as natural. Seasons swung the length of the day enormously, and lives were shaped by cold, hunger, labor, and interruption. The clock our ancestors carried was the same robust mechanism we carry, but the conditions it ran under were variable and often harsh. What the modern world introduced was not the first disruption of an otherwise perfect rhythm, but a new and peculiar kind of disruption, one defined less by hardship than by the sheer availability of light and the freedom to ignore the body's signals entirely, to push the night later and the morning dimmer simply because we can. This reframing matters because it changes what a sensible response would even look like. If the body had genuinely forgotten its rhythm, the task would be one of recovery, of relearning something lost. But the clock is not lost. It is intact, ancient, and remarkably durable, still doing precisely what it has always done. The task, then, is not to rebuild a forgotten rhythm, but to stop overriding one that never left. And the most powerful lever for doing so is the same signal. The clock has always trusted most. Light in the morning, ideally the genuine brightness of the outdoors, gives the clock a strong and unambiguous correction. Darkness, or at least dimness, in the evening allows the night signal to rise on something close to its natural schedule. None of this requires belief in a vanished paradise or a special discipline recovered from the past. It requires only the recognition that the body is running an old and faithful program, and that the kindest thing we can do is to stop feeding it contradictory information at the hours when it is most easily misled. There is a particular stillness to the image of Cipher underground, telephoning the surface in what he believed was the afternoon, while the world above moved through a different hour entirely, his mind unmoored from time while something deeper held its course beneath him. It is an image that inverts the usual way we think about ourselves. We tend to imagine that the conscious mind is in charge, that our sense of time is the real timekeeper, and the body merely follows. The cave revealed the opposite. The mind drifts, suggestible and easily fooled, while something older keeps the beat regardless, written into the rise and fall of proteins in every cell and carried in the daily chemistry of the blood. The rhythm has not been forgotten by the one place it actually lives. It has only been forgotten by us, by the schedules we keep and the lights we leave burning, by a world that has learned to act as though the sun were optional. The blood remembers, because the blood never stopped counting. What remains is the quieter and more difficult question of whether we are willing to listen to a measure we did not compose, cannot silence, and have spent a single bright century pretending we had outgrown.